Vous avez une carte ou pas?
Bon, moi je ne fais que vous présenter.
Et vous présentez l'étude personnellement.
Bon, alors je m'excuse, mais
I'm very sorry, but obviously not everybody has got back from the panettrie yet. I apologize. I will let the moderator of this session present his guests. There are very prestigious people, as in all the sessions. You never introduce a journalist because journalists are well-known people and they're here to talk about others. So there's no reason to introduce them, especially when it's a journalist from the written press who's working for the Figaro today after having worked for a variety of other periodicals previously. Here we have a person who has understood that the written press perhaps only had a limited future, and he created a new buzz in the form of Figaro Media, which is on internet, in the papers, and which also provides image content. And I think for the new subjects we are going to be tackling, this person is one of the best possible people to be moderating this very interesting session. Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. We'll start with presenting a study on the breakdown of roles between creators, producers, distributors, consumers, and public authorities. I hope we haven't forgotten anyone here, with the idea of who's got the power. And then there will be a round table where we'll be welcoming Christine Albanel, who's executive director in charge of the Orange Foundation and one for her public responsibilities. Christine Albanel was Minister of Culture and will be telling us about one of the laws that she brilliantly defended when she was in office. We also have Tarek Cherkaoui, who is the Chief Strategy Officer of the Qatar Museums Authority. And you can tell us a bit about Qatar's power in culture. And we have Martinj Arets, who is founder of Crowd Expedition, who will be telling us about the power of crowdfunding. That's something we talk quite a lot about, and there's a certain reality there we need to learn more about. We're also very happy to have with us Paul Dujardin, who is CEO of Beaux-Arts, which is the Palais des Beaux-Arts in Brussels, a place where we have culture and life and experiment and exchange. And let me now give you the floor for the presentation of your study, Kurtsaman. Thank you very much. Here we are. Good morning, everyone. Let me try to give you a summary of the work we've done for the Avignon Forum this year. During the course of this study, we had a look at the balance or imbalance all along the value chain for different multiples. We have the idea here of concentrating on a few sectors, which we will come back to. And in order to do this, we had a survey of 4,000 consumers throughout the world who we asked about their perceptions and their interests concerning these new tools that digital technology makes available to them, and the power that seems to give them. And we completed this study with about 40 interviews with different players who represent the sector. So by way of introduction, I would ask you to share with us a few bits of market data. It's always interesting to start by looking in the rearview mirror. From 2007 to 2011, in the different market cases we had a look at, in particular the cinema, games, music, and books, it's interesting to note that in spite of the idea you may have, this was a flat, stable market, or series of markets, with an average yearly growth of 0%. Now, when we have a look in more detail, you see that the situation is different from one market to the next, but the book market alone, at world level, had significant downward growth, minus 4% per year on average. And then music, again, in contrast to what you might think or have communicated, let me get back to my place here. The music market was also stable. Obviously, it depends how you define the market, but if you integrate concerts and recorded music at world level into music, the market was relatively stable. Good piece of news for the future. If we look at the models we developed at Kurt Salmon, in coming years, whichever one of these markets you look at, we think that they will go back to growth. And in cumulated average terms, we should have something like 5%, which in today's world is pretty good. Three different phenomena explain this growth. First of all, the increase in the number of connected terminals, smartphones, tablets, which increase the amount of consumption, and then the maturity of certain economic models of a digital type, such as SVOD, which have adapted themselves better to the way consumers use them and have allowed us to monetize content better. And then a third important phenomenon is the emergence of emerging countries who are making an important contribution to cultural consumption and which caused the market to take off again. Now, although markets were relatively stable in last years, I think that it's not you here in this room I need to tell that this has been a calm period. When you talk with different people who are active in this sector, at the end you conclude that structures of the value chain have not necessarily been transformed. The boundaries between the players are relatively comparable. But there have been changes concentrated within different links of the chain. For instance, we had a strong concentration of players on the production tab with big companies coming together. Vivendi has started working and publishing with Penguin and Random House, and this is a necessary concentration so as to respond to changes in the sector and the crisis which the sector was undergoing. But it was also a necessary concentration so as to respond to the emergence of players who were in a very strong competitive position for distributing digital products, and we'll come back to that. We've also seen a whole series of tools emerge, which are there for artists and for consumers to use, and which have allowed some people to have access to content on a practically infinite basis, sometimes excessively, some people would say. And these tools have also allowed artists and consumers to meet without having intermediaries such as producers or distributors, and also to allow professionals and artists to broadcast and share their production. But have those new tools really given power back to artists and consumers? In fact, when we have a closer look, most of the talent that has been spotted through these tools or via internet, it's interesting to see that as soon as talent is spotted on the web, they rush to join the traditional system. And when you have a look at the traditional players who had an adventure and declared independence for a while, most of them have also gone back to the traditional sector. A few examples to show what I mean. We had a look in the top 50 and the top 20 of publishing and music for self-producing artists. We looked hard and we didn't find any. Another piece of information. When we asked consumers, who we did ask in the context of the survey, if they intended to buy any works directly from an artist, 65% of consumers said that they were ready to buy a work directly from an artist. However, when you look at actual facts, which are sometimes a hard mistress, the actual average cost of a self-produced book today is 25 euros. So at the end of the day, you realize that these tools are wonderful means of exchange and of sharing, but that the real value of the sector nonetheless remains in the hands of the traditional players. And this multiplication of content and of capacity to distribute has done more than accelerate the Kleenex throwaway effect. And that tends to reduce the average life cycle of an artist in the sector and their possibility of living from their art over a longer period. Now, if we have a look at the other end of the chain, and consumers, As we were saying before, consumers, more than ever, have the possibility to have access to a rich and diverse choice of content. They have more than ever before the possibility of playing an active role in creation, becoming co-producers or co-creators. But when we take a more active interest in the idea of crowdfunding, we see that this is indeed a large and uncontestable phenomenon that is widely discussed. And when we ask the opinion of consumers, once again, we see that more than 8% are well ready to take part in this type of funding. But here, once again, if you look at the figures that correspond to actual reality, 3,500 euros is the average amount that projects get via crowdfunding. That's not going to be enough for a film, is it? And with Kickstarter, we saw that 75% of the funded projects got an amount less than 10,000 euros. So obviously, this is a fascinating phenomenon, and I'm sure we will come back to it. It's very interesting indeed in terms of bringing consumers and artists closer together and stimulating creativity. But at the end of the day, it would appear that it's only a complementary tool vis-a-vis traditional forms of funding. And we cannot expect to see this type of funding really compete with or replace traditional forms of funding. When we have a look at these models at Kurt Salmon, we're very optimistic. We think that by 2017, we'll have something like 10% of crowd-financed funding for the 4 sectors concerned. Let's go back to producers now. They have, in fact, had considerable concentration. They've had lots of restructuring. By way of an example, you see the figures of the different numbers of persons employed in the sector 2001-2010. And in parallel, they have also had to restructure themselves, adapt themselves to new working methods, new economic models, business models, even if sometimes that was perceived as happening too slowly. And what's interesting here is to see that at a point in time when basically we're going from a physical to a digital support, and by definition, the unit price of a given work between the physical and the digital support has gone down considerably. Those are the figures you see on the right-hand side. It's still interesting to note that producers are the value chain players whose revenue share or stream has gone up the most. By way of example, in book publishing, there was 30% of the price of a work before. Now it's 48 or 50% in digital. With games, it was 25% in physical and 40% in digital. Over the same period, the share that went to artists remained basically the same. The unit price of the product went down, and the volume in some markets also went down to a considerable extent. As far as producers are concerned, here the situation is differentiated from one market to another. You see that in book publishing and in music, the share which goes back to producers has been relatively stable, whereas in games and in cinema, it's gone down from 50 to 30%. We were talking before about the transformation of producers and their ability also to adapt to a new digital environment. It's interesting here to see how they have been able to take charge of new digital tools and how that's allowed them to reevaluate their own job. A producer is someone who spots talent, who invests in talent, who cultivates it, helps it to grow, and hopes at the end of the day to make back their investment. And here I'll say something, well, it's a bit like a pharmaceutical lab. They're managing a portfolio off there. I dared to say it. But today a producer, thanks to these new digital tools, are able to spot these new talents, in particular thanks to social networks, at a lower cost. They just let the system work. They sit back and observe, and then they can do some cherry picking when they see on social networks or elsewhere what's going on. They can, in fact, limit their investment risk because consumers have already expressed themselves. So if they're clever about the way they do this, they can take considerably less risk in a digital environment than they did before. By way of example, let's give you the example of Veronica Mars, which is a TV series which was pretty successful in the United States. And in fact, the scriptwriter and the leading lady wanted to go from the small screen to the big screen, and Warner Brothers, who produced the series, had some doubts about this, and they agreed on a test via a platform of Quick Start to evaluate consumers' interest in this project. And the result was that in 24 hours, $2.5 million were raised. I think there were 5 million at the end of the campaign, a fan community of over 100,000 who expressed themselves actively. The film is presently being finished and should come out next year. And I think it would be quite interesting to see how successful such a film might be in cinemas to validate whether Quickstarter is really the future impresario of tomorrow's Hollywood. And then, although there is an environment that has changed considerably in digital terms, the one that has changed the most is distribution. And here we see actors, players emerging in dominant positions on their respective. Amazon with 45%, Apple with 70% in music, 65% in music. And some people have been worried about the possibility of dominant positions emerging over time with all of the risk you can have with abuse of dominant market positions and the ideas you might have about how such markets might be structured. But in fact, what we observe today is that these platforms are tending to invade other markets and not their initial market, which tends, in fact, to create competition. So you had one player who was a leader on a given market. Now you see 2 or 3 or 4 more on a given market who are competing with each other. So this fear about a dominant position is beginning to recede. And in fact, what we're hoping to see is a healthier form of competition, even when we're talking about 3 or 4 players throughout the world. Another element we wanted to share with you, because it was relatively surprising to us, was the way in which consumers imagine that they consume physical supports over a period of 5 years. And when we asked the question, more than 50% of consumers, whatever product we were considering, imagined that over a period of 5 years they would go on buying physical support. And that's a result we wanted to share with you because we didn't expect to see that. And I think that also is a new possibility for traditional physical support producers to go on existing and going on being key players in the ecosystem of distribution of cultural products in the future. And finally, it's clear that all of these changes have appeared very rapidly, and that traditionally when you have this type of revolution, the legal and regulatory framework lags behind. And today, if we have distortions and problems, it's exactly because of that, because the legal and regulatory framework has not been able to follow the developments in the sector quickly enough. Difference between value-added tax levels between one country and another in Europe, heterogeneous tax structures, coexistence of right holders and copyright systems, and all of this has created distortions of the competition system, which means not everybody is playing with the same rules, and on a given market, that's never good. So even if it's a bit naive to hope that we will see relatively homogeneous rules of the game may emerge at the international level as a European citizen, and a few months before the European elections, I think that we are justified in hoping that it will be demanded of the European Commission that we have an acceleration of the convergence of this regulatory framework so that all players will be able to be playing with the same rules. And at the end of the day, I think we need to say, may the best player win, but to do that, you all have to be playing the same game. So by way of conclusion, people are telling me that I'm out of time here. We elaborated with all the different players who we met with a whole series of recommendations, which we've structured around 2 main orientations, which the Avignon Forum generally likes, plurality and diversity. And I'll let you see this yourselves in the study. If you're interested, it's available on the forum site and on the Kurzsalm site. We're talking here about harmonization of these tax and regulatory frameworks, but also about education. And there are also good things about sustainable development here, which we can manage in the cultural areas as well. And then the whole development of the system of funding that is being thought about today basically nationally in today's world, which is international. And so what is needed is to imagine how we can put together a policy or system for European financing so that we can all benefit from a culture that is as rich tomorrow as it has been yesterday. Thank you very much for that presentation. And I like this study very much because, first of all, there's already a positive message here because cultural industries are expected to grow by 5% a year in the future, and that's something that's fairly rare to hear, and that's a good thing to hear. And then generally speaking, I think a lot of studies basically just sort of go over platitudes, and here that's not the case. What you're basically saying, everything has to change so that nothing can change. And you still have the same players on the stage. You see that there's more risk, less margin, vice versa. We've seen that there are big movements, crowdfunding, self-publishing, and you gave figures that surprised me, about 25 euros for the average revenue from a self-published book, which is not terribly worthwhile, and 3,500 euros from a crowdfunded project, which doesn't take us very far either. And we've heard quite a lot in the press that digital was changing everything or was going to change everything. And what you're saying basically is we're looking at stabilization and that we've gotten back on an even keel and that boundaries seem to be pretty clear again. Well, we think that we're seeing business models here that are stabilizing. That is clear. Business models which are properly adapted to the specificities of the digital world and the way in which people consume in that world, and which have already shown that they work. They may not create as much value as they did in the past, but they are allowing us to monetize and to raise money in ways that will allow artists to go on living from creating their art, which seems to us quite crucial. And you've also, I think, very correctly summed this up. We're living in an environment where, I think you'd think I was pretty strange if I said nothing had changed and there wasn't a whole multitude of extraordinary tools that everyone can use today. But what is, I think, positive is that these are tools basically for sharing and for distribution. But in terms of the actual economic development of the sector and the people who manage wealth there, here the rules of the game have not changed as much as you might think. Thank you very much. So we'll now go on to the discussion, a round table with our guests. And we'll start with Christine Albanel, who is in charge of the Orange Foundation, former Minister of Culture. And here, when we're talking about consumers, creators, distributors, producers, and governments, who's got the power? Christine Albanel, you were Minister of Culture in charge of those issues, and you defended a law which was widely discussed at the time, which people criticized, the Adopi law. Well, what is the role of governments and public authorities here? Are they meant to be weighing in heavily in these discussions to create rules for consumers who normally are tempted to practice piracy with digital techniques? So what is the role of the state here? Yes, well, let me answer. Yes, of course. I think the role of policy remains important over and beyond those roles which are strictly reserved to the state and to government, and that's not entirely to do with digital affairs, but policy and politics can bring about big projects. We heard from a Tunisian woman this morning who talked about having Maisons de la Culture everywhere in Tunisia, which are centers for life and political resistance. And that's a bit the French project as well. That was Malraux's idea to open up ministries of culture to areas which were not traditionally theirs. There had been a Ministry of Fine Arts before that, and the idea to take it all over the country. And then we had a look at the Chirac Foundation and its activities. Jacques Toubon was there with us as well at Quai Branly at the museum there in Paris. And that was one of Jacques Chirac's big projects, which was somewhat unexpected. And it caused cultures to come into dialogue with one another and was a very strong signal of recognition for arts and civilizations that were neither known nor particularly respected, and they often were called primitive arts for that reason. So this was a political project, and I think that sometimes we need big political projects. Moreover, politics exists to defend values and principles. And among those values, many of you have mentioned, the Hadopi law, which included defending authors' rights, copyrights, and if you go back to that context, at that time in 2007, 2008, there had been a collapse of the musical industry. There was a huge market crisis because of piracy. The cinema was threatened as well, and people had to act. And that law, which was not an easy thing and is highly perfectible, Pierre Lescure's report made many further proposals, for instance, about bringing some players closer together. But here the idea of defending performing artists' rights, creators' rights, copyrights became part of the general discussion in France. We've realized things are difficult in Europe, which is true, but at the same time in Germany, we've seen this idea of a gradual response to something that has been defended in Germany by Bernemann, who is the federal minister in charge of culture. And there's another project in the United Kingdom. In the United States, there's a consortium. That's a different model, but which also brings together the different areas concerned, internet access providers, rights holders, so that they can understand one another better, agree, defend their rights. It's not the same model, but at the same time, there is a very strong pedagogical dimension involved. So I think that the government did the right thing, even if it's possible to do better, by defending those principles. Well, the government was reproached, which somewhat paradoxically, I would say, with trying to have a leading role and having policies that might be considered repressive. And I know that there were two different aspects. There was a pedagogical side, and there was the side about criminalizing certain activities. And some people say that on internet people should be allowed to do what they want, and you're saying there should be rules. Well, no, I think it is important to establish rules. Studies have shown that piracy has gone down, and that between 70 and 75% of web users say that as soon as they get a first email concerning piracy that they stopped. And all of that has happened with the development of a legal supply. Perhaps there would have been the development of that supply in any case, but I think that it has helped to create a favorable context for the development of that supply, and today it seems practically infinite. Now then, in terms of law enforcement, I am sorry that the law talked actually about arresting people. I think that was a mistake. At that time, I think people thought that it was still possible. It could still be done, that people could really be deprived of internet, that someone who had really been caught in the act X times, that you would be able to do that. And I think that we realized it's not possible, and that was the mistake. I think there should have been a system of fines that would have been more moderated. I think that's the regret I have concerning that law. But the pedagogical side of things, the idea of having some limitative law enforcement aspect involved, I think that is important, and it did facilitate the debate. Well, the Kurt-Selman study shows very clearly that political players still have work to do in terms of harmonizing tax networks and the value-added tax in particular. And here, do you think that Europe, who has now taken charge of the subject, and the OECD, even if they're not a political authority, but they are a public sector player, do you think that they need to accelerate this process? Do you think that they can manage to harmonize tax rules? I think it's indispensable. Among these different principles involved, there's the principle of equity. At present, as you reminded us, I work for Orange, and I think that that's an example of a major group which is highly regulated and which contributes quite a lot to the funding of culture in the broadest sense. If we put together all the different taxes involved, taxes on TV channels, on private copies, on different forms of compensation, of for suppression of advertising on public channels, all the things concerning content produced by Orange, cinemas, sponsoring, partnership. All of this is quite considerable. We have partnership with the main cultural institutions that represents, also working on digital books. And we have that exactly sponsoring with the BNF, but a major project for digital books with an open model, which is now becoming a mature project, and we're at the prototype stage, and we think that it will get to the industrial stage with many publishers and booksellers and other players in the profession. It's a very committed group, which is overtaxed, overregulated, and alongside that, we have internet players who basically manage to pay no tax. We calculate that in France, there's maybe 1.2 billion of lost tax revenue for the tax authorities, a much higher figure in the United States. And we see that there is no territorialization. They set up shop in Luxembourg, and it's a way of breaking with equity. It's a situation which seems to me not very acceptable. It's a major combat. It should be a major European combat, and we need to make progress here because we're really talking about the future of our own cultural industries. Well, this will certainly be a debate in the European elections in 2014. Or do you not think so? Well, I think the European elections often are not of terrific interest to voters because of the things they should be expressing, even if Europe is perhaps the biggest possible fight we might have on our hands today. And often culture is not considered to be a European subject because of subsidiarity, which means that it's not really up to Europe to deal with cultural matters. But today we're seeing that that is the case. Well, Christine Albanel, we saw that when you were minister, you thought that the telecoms had their pockets full, and today that you're working for Orange, you seem to feel they're overtaxed. Oh, that's quite true. That's quite true. So when Orange tried to become a distributor of cultural products, it wasn't a huge success. So do you think that telecom operators ought to be playing a more engaged role in the production or at least the distribution of cultural products? Well, I think telecom operators do create books and content and networks and invest quite a lot. You're quite right to say the public authorities always have the feeling that there are fat cats, as we say in English, and now in French as well. Because when you're on the public side of things, you seem to see just the turnover, and you don't see so much the necessary investments and all of the constraints that big firms have and everything that they contribute in terms of employment and prosperity, especially in a context of very strong competition. Thank you very much. Now let me turn toward Tarek, who is the Chief Strategy Officer for the Qatar Museums Authority. And we're still going to stay with the role of what the public sector does. Qatar is very well known for Al Jazeera. And so you have a certain amount of power and information, and also in sports because you've invested in a sports channel as well. Is culture the third pillar of Qatar's soft power? Well, first of all, good morning to everyone. Excuse me, I should be speaking English. I've been working in a basically English-speaking context for the last 20 years, and the last 2 days in France, unfortunately, have not been enough for me to thaw out my rather frozen French.
Well, in Qatar, 10 years ago, we have written a vision for the state. And this vision is aimed at making Qatar a modern country by 2030, with culture very much part of it. In developing this program, an overriding objective was to strike a perfect balance between what we need to modernize and what we should conserve. My first example in this sense is one of the projects that we are currently working on. Is called Al-Wakra Creative Hub. I feel this project is very much in the context that we are discussing today. First, because it is about bringing to life again what used to be a very old fishing village. So basically, what we did is we provided in the first phase a subsidized approach in which we subsidize accommodation and workplace for artists and craftsmen. Alongside that, we are bringing in the private sector to provide hotels and services. But also, we are also partnering with key business partners such as banks to provide microloans for the potential applicants. As a result of all this activity, employment of local people is expected to rise steadily. As you can see in this example, arguably everybody has some power and everybody is benefiting. I have a second example which is less tangible but arguably more influential in the international stage. Culture is indeed unique in its power to help people to connect. Every year, we organize a year of friendship with the different nations. In 2013, actually, we organized a year of friendship with the United Kingdom. What happened was, to Qatar came the Royal Shakespeare Company and the BBC Philharmonic Orchestra and others, but to the other side, to the opposite direction, we organized the Pearl exhibition at the V&A. Again, in this example, I'm not sure who's got the power, but everybody benefits. My last example is less tangible, but arguably more influential, and it has a very significant impact in the cultural sphere. The education policy, our education policy, is a central pillar in our long-term strategy. We are delighted to have partnered with many world-class universities. For example, just to give you one, we have partnered with the University College of London. And in this sense, we built a campus, we fund the teaching faculty, we provided scholarships for all local students, and we provided pathways for people in the sphere of culture. Again, because the state is funding all these activities, it would seem that the state is the source of all the power. Well, let's see what the students say when they graduate. And finally, just to conclude, what I want to say is, in developing our program, cultural program, and to make it successful, we want to make sure that no one group holds all the power. Thank you.
Thank you. You said you don't know who's got the power, but I think that the main issue is who's got the money, and I'm sure that Qatar state has a huge amount of money. Could you tell us how much do you invest in a cultural program?
Well, again, I would rather not perpetuate some stereotypes. We don't want Qatar always to be seen as the perpetual money-making machine, or the money-vending machine that is just there to be clicked. No, what we really want you to, and what I want really the people in this room and this forum to understand, is that we are really at heart following these programs. We try to really build programs for our local population first, but also to be very active in the international stage. It's not a luxury. It's not we are doing this pour être des frimeurs. Rather, what we want to do is, it's a matter of survival. We live in a very difficult neighborhood, you know that. Our neighbors are Iran, Iraq, and the list is very long. So in order to be engaged in a process of peace, we believe that culture is one of these bridges with all around the world. We build bridges. We love France, we love the value of France, but we also value all the culture that comes from all the nations of the world, and therefore we have these years of friendship. I mean, this year was UK, last year was Japan, next year will be Brazil, so it's very diverse, and we will have France as well in the program, of course. We are very, il y a un engouement pour la France qui est vraiment très fort au Qatar.
There is a love of France in Qatar. What are you going to do with France?
A lot of exchanges that we have doing. We have a lot of partnerships, but there will be 1 year dedicated to the friendship with France through multiple programs in which we'll have French museums and French art centers coming with their programs to Qatar, and going to the other side, we'll have also some activities there.
Okay, and how do you promote a cultural dialogue between different nations or different culture? How do you mix traditional Islamic culture and Western culture?
Well, this is a very interesting question. I think that what's really happening is we want really to promote what we believe are inner values to the Qatar, but also to be a good listener and a good participant in the world culture, because we feel that we are part and parcel of humanity, and a part and parcel of the dialogue that exists with all the nations of the world, and therefore we are engaged with all these activities.
Thank you. On reviendra.
Thank you. We'll come back to that in the discussion. Let me move on to Paul Dujardin, who is Chief Executive Officer of the Palais des Beaux-Arts in Belgium, a center of interdisciplinary art, a large range of exhibitions, debates, concerts. Do you think that in the Palais des Beaux-Arts, that's where cultural practices can be reinvented? Well, I think that reacting to the Kurt Salman's study, just let me make a point about that. I think it's important that we've seen a move back towards live performances, artists actually at the center of these performances. And as you said earlier on, a project like the Beaux-Arts and Avignon here, the Festival of Avignon, the interdisciplinary festival, was a leader after the Second World War, and the Pompidou Center in the 1960s. They have really taken the leadership in research and innovation, and I think it's very important, as well as the artist now coming back to the center of the European cultural project. And it seems to me that you talked about that bottom-up issue in Europe very well, because Europe has a tremendous responsibility there. Even if regional and national policies are important, the complexity of the European scene means that even if culture is considered as subsidiary, we must give a new narrative to innovation and research. I think the world of the academic world, the world of research, the artistic world have to meet. On one hand, artists and creation, on the other, research and academia. Research and creativity we've seen in other types of research. If the two worlds meet, both in companies like telecoms operators and others, then research can be developed in a very, very productive way. And I'd also say that it's important in development. It's not only telecoms that should talk about what they do for society. If you look at Africa, for instance, Africa is supposedly the lost continent. It's not a lost continent at all. What's going on there and what people are doing with mobile phones in Africa, in security, in banking and things of that kind, you can't get loans from banks, but you can get microloans. And people use their phones to send a few tens of euros to other people. And that's really creative in Africa today. So what telecoms are doing and what research has enabled it to do is really great. And it's a spillover. And what we must find are those spillovers, and that spillover comes from interdisciplinarity, as you were saying earlier on. I think we have the world around us is far too specialized, and I think we need to move towards interdisciplinarity in Europe, in the world. 0.005% of Europe is involved in culture, and I think it's important that it does more to get across the message of what European culture is about. We've just invented the Lux Prize in Brussels for movie making, and that's an important prize. And it's important that public television channels and the public authorities continue to invest in European movie making. But it's also a way, and that's also important, to democratize these big societal debates through movie making. You were asking earlier on about whether people are interested in European elections. But I think it's important that movie making gets involved in this. And movie making focuses on what's going on in the European Parliament, and that artists, through the movies, which is one of the best ways of talking about politics today, apart from the Avignon Forum, is to focus on the major cultural and economic debates. And the Palais des Beaux-Arts in Brussels, it can not only be a kind of third power, but apart from the European external policy, which is shaped in Brussels, and apart from the European Commission and the European Parliament, especially the European Commission, which is a huge bureaucratic machine, I think it is possible to do something else, to have a new type of entity springing up and creating links between European creative artists and European scientists. And that could be very creative. It's important to have empathy for everything which is not understood by Brussels, by the bureaucratic machine in Brussels, and to create powers, which was what we're trying to do in the Palais des Beaux-Arts. And what we've always tried to do. When the Palais des Beaux-Arts was set up in the 1920s, science and art was in symbiosis. It's been forced apart since then, and now it's coming together again, or it should come together again. We've forgotten about, we haven't talked about museums, we've concerts, opera, design. All that is part of what we're talking about. And it's also influenced by the digital developments, but it's important that we have founding members of Europe, France, Belgium, Italy. They've invested after the war in nuclear energy, and now that European research effort should focus on creating a new narrative for research. Why are we doing the research to create the kind of project we're talking about? What's its content? The content is what we're discussing here in Avignon over these 3 days. And I think the Palais des Beaux-Arts in Brussels has shouldered its responsibilities in that respect, has put on 10,000 activities every year, and the more we shift to digital, the more people come. What Henri Loiret has done in the Louvre and the Victoria and Albert Museum have done is tremendous. The V&A was totally uninteresting 30 years ago, but in museums in London today, there is no museum which is more visited than the Tate. And multinational companies prefer to invest in the Tate because the Tate Gallery is very much an institution in which there are debates going on. There is a new power being created, as in the Louvre, as in the Palais des Beaux-Arts. It's those are the most important artistic centers in Europe today, and a new power can come to the fore, independently of the economic crisis that we are experiencing in France and elsewhere in Europe at the moment. The mood is very gloomy, but I think that gloomy mood can be broken by greater symbiosis and bottom-up growth between research and artistic creation, so that we invest together in a common project. And that's why I wanted to be here today, and that's why I wanted to participate in this type of debate. Thank you. But you've said very concretely, creators, artistic creators must take power. They are the ones who give flesh and blood to these new artistic centers, and they can defend their views vis-à-vis politicians. Are you saying that the creators have the power? Yes, yes, yes. We were talking in the 1970s of lock keepers. The lock keepers were the directors of opera houses, theaters, museum directors, and it was they who determined what we saw. Now, the digital world makes it possible for everyone to determine what we see. And I think that means that there is a new space for artistic creation, all forms of artistic creation. I haven't seen any fall in quality, I must say. On the contrary, the only question I think that does arise in a meeting of this kind as elsewhere is, where are the artists themselves in this debate? Are they involved in this debate? What is their responsibility in this debate? And it seems to me that they must speak to the politicians, and together, when movie makers come to Brussels to see Karel de Gucht, they should come with other artists and talk to him about culture. There was a meeting in the Sorbonne a few weeks ago in which all these issues were raised, and there was a kind of consensus achieved between society and culture, where society must listen to the artists. And I think there is a definite political will in Brussels to do that. They want that multicultural, multinational view, and I think there must be a political determination to create this new platform, and it would be visionary and utopian to create not only in Brussels, not only a bureaucratic institution, but an artistic center which can talk to the politicians, which can talk to industry, because industry, of course, is also present, and would be responsible for creating that bridge between research, innovation, and the politics in order to benefit the Europe of tomorrow. Okay, I hear what you're saying about the creation of the platform and mobilizing the artists, but I wanted to come back to you. What was important in Kurt Salman's study was what your conclusion was that the greater the digital world, the more we have live music, and the more museums are doing well. People are returning to the live performance, to the physical experience, to touching what's going on. What's your vision of the museum in the 21st century and the digital world? How can they be brought together? But I think it's just as important here as in the other debates, our links with our heritage. To take the example of the Louvre and a French project which is being exported to Abu Dhabi. It's going to be globalized, not to Qatar, but to Abu Dhabi. But this makes a big difference. If we have artists coming from the Middle East tomorrow, they're going to earn more. And that is basically very positive. The Louvre, with its heritage and with its desire to be global, the development of the vision of French museums and European museums, which have tried to reach out to the Middle East. Jacques-André started there. It's projecting the European heritage and European formats to the rest of the world. The European Parliament is carrying out a pilot project that is going to be presented next February about the extraordinary positive perception of the European model outside Europe. There is a gloomy attitude in Europe. People say that in Europe everything is lost. But there is a fascination in the rest of the world, in the Emirates, in Qatar, but in the African world, in other areas of the world, for the European model. Rem Koolhaas, a Dutch architect, for instance, if he was not interested in dialogue, he couldn't build the new headquarters for the public television in Beijing. So there is an appeal of the European model. Coming back to the example of museums, the Palais des Beaux-Arts after the Second World War was a utopia. The Pompidou Center in the 1960s, other places in London, they are the Tate Modern in London. They are examples. There is the Werther Festival near Brussels, 250,000 people every year, where artists can live, work, and one of the advisors to Mitterrand said the 21st century would be the century of nomadism. And I think we're now coming back to the previous model, people being in residence. As the Festival of Avignon is, people are resident and reach out to the public from their residency. And the National Theatre in London has introduced streaming, and this is a new economic model after Mrs. Thatcher's decision to reduce public subsidies, and they reacted by streaming, and they've created new resources for the Royal Shakespeare Company through streaming, through the digital presentation. The Metropolitan Opera has done the same thing by broadcasting operas in cinema halls, in theatre halls. And that makes it possible for more and more people to witness the extraordinary quality of the Ring cycle. Arte also has a project of this kind together with the European Broadcasting Association, is doing similar things. So the museum today is more than a museum. It's a place of utopia. The Pompidou Museum is not just a museum. It's a place of meeting. It's a library. It's an exhibition hall. It's an architectural symbol in the heart of Paris. It's a benchmark in the city of tomorrow. So it's no longer it is simply in its corner. The Rijks Museum, the Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam, the Concertgebouw, they are all around a square in Amsterdam. And it's important that these places are all reconnected. It's easier to do that in Avignon than it is in a large city like Paris. But I hope that the new hall built by Jean Nouvel outside Paris, because there are only in the center of Paris, most of the people who go to see culture or to witness culture live in the center of Paris. And there have to be places outside Paris where people can also go. And Jean Nouvel is building a new concert hall, 200 million. This has been criticized. But it's important that there are new types of public. The middle classes who produce the Europe of the 20th century should benefit from culture. France Culture now has a market share of 4 to 5%, and that's because there is the middle class which listens to it. The idea that you're expressing here is that you want museums to develop a digital platform, to develop further, to reconnect, and there's the Google Art project. Are you do you think that's a good thing? Yes, yes. I wasn't in the previous debate, but I saw a lady here who was very determined in what she said. I think we must bring technology into museums, but we must do it with artists, with the creative artists. We must not only take digital and introduce it into museums, we have to develop it together and not simply consume that technology. And I think it's incredible what artists can do with digital technology. Luc Chairman Commons, a well-known Belgian painter, is going to produce a new work of art in Qatar through digital technology, and he's doing it and has done it with engineers, in cooperation with engineers, and he started with a 16th century Flemish painting that he has reworked into a traditional painting and that he is now redeveloping on a public square thanks to digital technology and thanks to the sponsorship of Qatar. So that's how that kind of activity, artistic activity, can be integrated into a museum by various artists. Tarek Cherkaoui.
Attractive for the rest of the world?
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is undeniable. I think I share absolutely what Mr. Dujardin has said before. I think the real power that the culture has in Europe overall, in France and other countries, is essential. I think a lot of players around the world, I'm not only mentioning Qatar or the Gulf region, but also nations in the East Asia, like China, like other countries like Singapore, Malaysia, etc. There is a real need to be inspired by the European know-how in culture and also the creativity that surrounds this. Also, regarding the institutions of the 21st century, I mean, this is exactly what we are trying to build. We are trying to build the museums of the 21st century. It is essential that it has these digital platforms. I'll give you just an example. One of our projects in the pipeline is the National Museum of Qatar, and it will be relying a lot on the digital platforms, because as you know, it's very difficult to find collections of the Arabian Peninsula because of the Bedouin tradition. So there is a more emphasis on the oral history and on the visual representations of that heritage. So definitely there are a lot of pathways of cooperation ahead. I think the best is still ahead of us, and we need to brace ourselves for more cooperation.
Vous voulez intervenir?
Non,
Just two brief comments, if I may. First of all, to tie in with what my neighbor was saying, museums today are a place, an extraordinary meeting place for people. Just let me give you a small example of a project we developed in Versailles. And it's a digital visit of Versailles with Eric Orsenat, who was here last night and who is absolutely fascinated by digital, and Pen Non, who has just exhibited in Versailles. I'm sure everyone's seen the Pen Non exhibition in Versailles. There was a real meeting there between a writer, a place of heritage, and a public operator and an artist. So I would agree with everything that's been said. There is a Europe of works, there's a Europe of artists, and nothing is more familiar to us than Hanneke's Germany or Almodovar's Spain. There is a Europe of works and a Europe of artists. Very briefly, I wanted to come back to that. You said earlier on an increasing amount of offers. Will there be too much on offer? No, I don't think there will ever be too much on offer for our public. But very quickly on technology. Technology is fundamental, but technology must invent a new language, as I was saying earlier on. I think a very good example, I wasn't there, and I'm sorry I wasn't there, but Anderes Kiersmag, the Rosace here in the Palais des Papes. And when she created that, she worked with the most natural elements. The sunrise, when the sun rose at 3 o'clock in the morning, she produced her creative work on the basis of the reality of a historic site, the Court of Honor in the Palais des Papes. She then repeated that in Brussels, in Paris, with Michel François, a sculptor, and she gave a very good example of how today's technology can create the same type of lighting in a theater. And it was very important to see how she could recreate that atmosphere of the sun rising in a theater. Elliot Fearson did that in the Tate a few years ago in the Tate in London. A Danish, Icelandish artist in a place like the Tate was able to prove that he could use all these new technologies to create, but you can't feel it unless you're there. When you're looking at a building, you can feel it, and that's what's great about European culture.
Crowd expedition. According to the Kurt Salmon survey, crowdfunding is a fast-growing sector, but it counts for just 1% of global cultural investment. Will crowdfunding remain marginal?
I think it's quite hard to say because I really like the research, but I think it's too early to make conclusions. Why? Because we are now in the middle of a revolution. We are in the start of a revolution. I saw a couple of weeks ago a video, a Dutch video. It was recorded about 10 years ago, and they were doing interviews on the streets, asking people, okay, do you want to have a cell phone? And all people said, come on. Then I'm riding on a bicycle, and then somebody calls me, and then I have to talk to people when I'm riding on a bicycle. So everybody said, okay, come on, I'm not going to do it. And I think the same with crowdfunding. It's quite hard to predict how big it's going to be. Where I am sure of is that it's going to be one of the ways to finance art or companies. It's not going to change. It's not going to defeat banks or whatever. It's just going to be an extra option. And I think also with the crowdfunding, I think the most interesting part of it is not the funding part, because it also costs lots of time to get the funding, but it's more the crowd part. Because when you look at the revolution, I think what is a revolution is that artists and people, producers, they can build up a really good long-term relationship with their audience. And one time they're going to ask money with crowdfunding, there are the other time ideas, so it's just a mix. It's not only look at one instrument, but it's more the magic of the combination of all the new possibilities.
Okay, and do you think that crowdfunding could stimulate creativity and could stimulate new projects? For example, your project around expedition, it's a mix between art and lifestyle or sport experience. Do you think that crowdfunding is a good, an appropriate tool for funding that?
Yes, it is. But also for my own projects, I use crowdfunding just for a part of the funding. So I'm always looking for a different combination of different kind of funding. So also means like sponsoring or just subsidies, they're always also a part of the funding part. And I think, like I said before, the best value of crowdfunding is the crowd part. So I really use in my projects the crowdfunding parts to get new ambassadors, because like I crowdfunded the English translation of my book, so I raised €20,000 in 10 weeks with 171 investors. And when people invest in you, in your project, in your idea, they give you money. But by giving you the money, they also become an ambassador of your project, because they don't give you money when they don't like your project. And with these people, so I was watching, okay, what are these people doing in daily life? And there was an accountant, a designer, lots of really interesting people. And they're also helping me through their occupation with making the project possible. So the funding, the money part is just a small part of the value you get out of this crowdfunding adventure.
Oui, non, je vous rejoins tout à fait. Effectivement, je pense que le financement n'est qu'une...
Well, I think that funding is just one part of the experience in a platform. Perhaps it's, first of all, a way to exchange and to share and to be creative. And this platform is something we see very clearly. It's not really there to finance works, but to bring people together and to give feedback to artists who, up until now, were somewhat isolated. And I think that's a real value above and beyond financial value.
Crowdfunding sustainable without a legal and a financial warranties for a consumer. You said when a consumer invests in a crowdfunding project, he is he supports this project, he belongs to this project, but sometimes he needs a return, a financial return or a legal guarantee. How can you do for giving us legal and financial guarantees?
Yeah, when you look at crowdfunding, there are four kinds of crowdfunding. There are the donation-based, so people just give you money because they like it and they want to make your project happen. The other one is the pre-sales, so they pre-sale like Kickstarter, so they want to have your product or your game. The other one is loans, and the last one is equity-based. And I think with the last two, it's really important to look, okay, how big is the chance that I will get my money back? And crowdfunding is a quite young instrument, and what you see now also on European level is that people are looking together. Okay, how can we give the crowdfunding investors a better chance of getting the money back? Because, but I don't really worry about that because when you look at crowdfunding, it's really a personal thing. I always say that you can better screw a bank because you won't meet a bank in the bar. Because when I'm going to raise, like in my case, 20,000 euro, and when I screw it up, lots of my friends also invested in my book. So I will meet them at birthday parties, in the bar, wherever. So I think by running a crowdfunding campaign, you also have to be really transparent. But there has to be some regulation, especially when you look at the loan and the equity-based crowdfunding. I was the first in the world who finished an equity-based crowdfunding campaign, and that sounds really cool, but in practice it was a disaster because I was also the first who was into the machine of the taxes and accountancy, and there has to change a lot to make it happen on the long term.
Thank you, Martin. On va consacrer quelques minutes au...
And now we'll spend a few minutes on questions from the floor. I imagine there will be some. Christian de Boissieu, I'm an economist. Also from the orientation board of the forum, the steering card. I'd like to go back briefly to crowdfunding, which is called finance participative in France. First of all, it doesn't only concern the cultural sector. It's got a lot to do with that sector, but lots of others as well. And secondly, I come from a regulatory body. I work with the regulation of financial markets. And from the Financial Market Authority, we have a look at what goes on in the crowdfunding market, and we've been doing this in particular for the last year. In France, figures are fairly low. You reminded us that means that there's a big potential catch-up effect with countries who are way ahead of us, like the United States. That's the first feeling, then, catch-up. Second feeling, the financial crisis since 2007 is also a crisis concerning confidence in finance. If there are problems on the crowdfunding market in the months or years that come, we could lose confidence in that for some time. It would be hard to bring it back. So regulators in France, you said there's the same approach in Europe, generally speaking. What are the main demands here? Transparency, first of all, and I would also say a certain degree of security. The discussion that was kicked off by our Indian friend Amit Khanna yesterday when he said that French people always try to regulate everything. Well, let me try to intervene here as a co-regulator in France to say that we have to let these forms of finance develop, but at the same time, we have to bear in mind these needs for transparency, for security, and for upholding confidence. And if I could just finish with the word on the Kurt Salmon study, what I am keeping in mind here, I think in the next 2 or 3 years, we'll be living in an international context where world growth will be something like 2 or 3% a year. So I think we should just be aware of that. Now, what you're saying at the end of your presentation is that in the cultural field, however you defined it, but basically broadly defined, you'll have a 5% per year figure. So for the world in general, we're in a scenario where the cultural sector will be growing 2% faster than the world at large. And so what's interesting here is not simply to think on a worldwide basis, but also region by region, because this gap, which seems to be very interesting, between these two growth rates will not be the same in all regions. And that confirms everything we've been saying since yesterday, quantitatively. qualitatively the things we've been saying since yesterday, saying that culture is a growth factor and remains that. I think that is precisely the articulation around that gap that I would like to remind you all of here in the room and that I draw from your study. Well, thank you very much. Crowdfunding is regulated by groups like the Financial Market Authority in France, or? Yes, of course. I think that we had one meeting of the board and we had a look at the Financial Market Authority's activities in crowdfunding in France and in Europe, and for the time being, we are in what we call soft regulation. It's still a relatively open field. You said yourself, and our friend from the Netherlands said, that this will probably have to be tackled at European level first. But the feeling we have is that even if the figures are low, the stakes we're playing for in terms of confidence are high. And we need to have a look at that, leaving the decentralized initiatives go on developing. Thank you. Are there any other questions from the floor?
Merci, Françoise Benamou.
Françoise Benamou. May I? Françoise Benamou, I'm an economist. I have a question on the study which seemed to me very interesting. And then we went on to something else in the discussion. But the study seemed to say that there was value sharing that was extremely stable between the different players in the cultural arena in spite of the developments we see around us and the rise of digital affairs. And I wonder if this is comparable to what we see with the rise of internet giants and the space they're now occupying in the value chain, if you could tell us a bit about that. Well, I went over that quite quickly, but what I did try to show was that obviously that's one link in the chain, whatever intermediaries we're dealing with, even if they've disappeared and they may be different from one sector to the next. People who produced CDs, for instance, aren't with us anymore. But those values tend to have been captured by producers. And what we show is that producers in general, and proportionally speaking, capture more unit value than they did earlier in the physical era. So there is a development here. There's a value shift between different players. But here the unit price has gone down, and we talked about the consumption of volumes because of piracy was going down as well. So there was less value. But the only player that remained stable in that bull market, if you will, was the artist. Well, I want to come back and answer Mr. Dujardin at one point, because he talked about me without naming me, if you will. I'm Elizabeth Markovich, and I created this TV channel called Econotele that I presented just before this roundtable, and I wanted to come back to him saying that 50% of our content is made with artists, that I now have 10% of the content which is made for us and with us, that is to say we co-produce with the artist, and we distribute their works on our channel. And these works, just like our video production, will be downloadable at a price of €1.89. And in the analysis, the reason for which there was no consideration of visual arts is because there's no downloading there. And we have a launch before Christmas at €1.89, and there the sharing will be 50-50. So visual artists will be making a lot more with us than they will in any of the other figures you've seen anywhere else. We are going to take more than the artists are taking. That doesn't seem normal to us. So our channel is really for and with artists and institutions. And the fact that we are as well distributed as we are, especially in Arabic countries today, well, we've done quite a lot for Qatar without Qatar necessarily knowing that. Thank you very much. Another question? Sanagidima from Tunisia. My question, in fact, I have two questions for Mr. Cherkaoui. The first is that we're talking about consumers, creators, distributors of culture. This is something universal. There's no doubt of that. But I can't be here without mentioning the idea of cultural and mediatic prisoners in Qatar, Mr. Al who created El Jazeera Children and who was one of the cultural pillars of Qatar, a Tunisian who you went and recruited in Switzerland and who is now basically under house arrest in Qatar without having been clearly accused of anything but being deprived of the right to travel. This isn't how we build culture. Second thing, we approached the Qatar Foundation to save a private library, one of the most important enlightened Islam, the Naifar Library, which has more than 40,000 works that are presently falling apart. And after 4 official visits by Qataris to Tunisia, we were asked to physically buy the library rather than to digitalize it and make it available for all of humanity. What do you think of that? Is that how we build culture?
D'abord, je vous remercie pour ces questions.
First of all, let me thank you for your questions. Concerning the first question on Mr. Bouneb, you must know that this is presently sub judice. The justice authorities are undertaking the necessary investigations, and that's the same everywhere in the world. When you are the subject of an investigation, you are not allowed to travel. I think that's something which follows international standards. This has been going on for 2 years, that's true, but investigators are doing their work. I thank you for your question, but I really don't see where the actual problem is now. On the second aspect, I think you said when you spoke that 4 official trips were made. I think that proves that Qatar is engaged. They came to Tunisia. I myself participated in those discussions. There were memorandums of understanding being signed. And it was the Tunisian side that complicated things. That's what happened. I'm very sorry if it didn't happen the way that you would have liked. But it does prove, I think, that our intentions are good, that Qatar is widely present and wants to cooperate. Thanks very much, but I'm afraid that doesn't concern us. Thank you very much for those direct answers to the direct question. Well, since I'm being looked at, I wanted to give good news to Christine Albanel, who is talking about equality and equity in terms of taxpayers. It's that the European Commission has finally validated the tax on the distribution of audiovisual services in France, and Orange, who had been perfectly virtuous, will now see its competitors pay the same percentage amounts. And I would remind you all that Mr. Barroso and his commission have cost 100 million euros for creation of cinema and audiovisual in France. And we hope that next year we will get a president of the commission who will know how to create a Europe of culture.
Merci. Y a-t-il encore une dernière?
Thank you very much. One last question from the room. Well, when I said last, obviously there's quite a lot of last here, but one quick question, and then we'll try to answer as rapidly as possible as well. Thank you. Sandro Tavardi-Fortier. I teach literary property law. It's not really a question, but we were talking about the Europe of creators. Law is also a cultural object, which we forget. We talk about regulation and technical matters, but law carries a philosophical image of a society. And the conflict that exists today that we're not really talking about between those who defend the law concerning works as an object and right holders' rights, that gets away from the idea of the object at the center. When we talk about the loss of earnings for those who create, I think we have to think exactly about those without whom there will not be thought, there will not be works. And they should be the focal point of these legal considerations. Free circulation and especially freedom of expression are directly conditioned by the fact that the creator is in the center of the picture. Let's go back to the 18th century. Copyrights were set up so as to free creators from certain forms of sponsorship, which basically meant that overly agitated persons were obliged to bite their tongues, that other people could exert pressure on them. And today, I think public opinion needs to understand that copyright is not against the public. It's rather something which is favorable to the public's access to creation, without mentioning that that also ends the temptation to create boundaries between amateurs and professionals. That's something very important. Copyright as it exists today is favorable to all authors, whether you personally hold rights or not. And everyone who is a possible author is being defended by a copyright scheme. Thank you very much. I don't know in what order. Denise Bombardier from Quebec, in Canada. I should like to ask Mr. Dujardin whether the coming to power of artists in Belgium is inversely proportional to the collapse of politics in your country. Well, I don't know if all the citizens here in this superb space in the Avignon Forum are going to be interested by Belgian politics. But I would say as a European that when I visit Baltic countries and I see the complexity of the rest of Europe, we always think the grass is always greener, or that the Commission will be better tomorrow without Barroso than it is today with Barroso. I think that is a good reaction, but there is an element that in Belgium, we are obliged to be very creative and to do it ourselves and to survive in a certain form of complexity. There are 5 governments for a country of 10 million inhabitants, but it's also absurd, I think we can say in this group here. That's an absurd side of democracy. On the one hand, I am very proud that democracy has developed in the way it has because it has given many opportunities. But at the same time, we now find ourselves at a sort of boundary. And we can say that there is something negative to that as well, but I would see it rather as a marvelous form of complementarity. Lille, in the north of France, Madame Aubry said it was a city of Flemish culture, and this diversity between the north of France, Flanders, Hainaut, and the Principality of Liège. You have different languages and cultures, and I think it's much more a question of complementarity than of opposition. And that's what makes our country strong and has been the force of our artists, Van Eyck and others. We've said that opera and painting are dead in France. And I think that you can see in these cultural circles that we are still there in Belgium, and they seem to adore us in France, both in Avignon and in Paris. The gentleman over there, and then the other gentleman. Thank you very much. Eduardo Brown from Chile. I'm a conductor. Generally speaking, I find that when we talk about what someone has defined as cultivated culture, which is to say, forms of culture which do not concern ways of living, but knowledge of arts and other loftier things, I think that here we expose ourselves to the idea of being a museum. We've talked actually quite a lot about museums today. And for those of us who are here, I would like to ask how many of us who constantly consume culture also create culture. It's difficult to be a museum, to see children learning from certain very beautiful works rather than having them paint or having them draw. It's like learning to write or to draft a text. And I wonder how many of us personally undertake creative activities, those of us who are here constantly to speak of culture. I myself, as a conductor, people say, well, you're a musician, so you are creating culture all the time. But in fact, there are many different ways to create culture. And I'm not trying to excuse myself here. I am reproducing Beethoven's major works. That's my job, but it's a bit what a tape recorder would do. I try to contribute to culture when I... Could you ask for a... No, I'm not asking a question. It's simply to say something, because I think that sometimes we speak at too high a level. And for instance, if Martinj's project, which is a very interesting one, given the way it was presented here, it's almost like investment banking, but I think that's something that we need to ask ourselves. What is our approach to culture, and how are we going to transmit that to young generations who might want something less lofty and more creative that they can make with their own hands? Thank you very much for that statement. The gentleman in the first row, please. My question is very short. Mario D'Angelo from the Association Idées Europe. Creators, consumers, producers, distributors. Where are the people who make norms and set standards? The consumers, because I think that's the whole idea of the digital era. That's the consumer who sets the rules. The danger here, perhaps, is that consumers have the impression they have all the power because they can lay down the law. But often, at the end of the day, Amazon's power, because of its recommendation system, is much greater than apparently freely addicted laws and the idea of word of mouth. It's a sort of algorithm, really. When you have a human recommendation, in the same sentence, you're going to say that you liked the last Haneke film, or Gravity, or Guillaume et Garçon, and you'll say that using various quality criteria, and you can basically be imprisoned by various rating systems. But at the same time, I do think it's the consumer who lays down the law.
The people are always in control. Why? Because at the end, big platforms like Amazon, like Facebook, they rely at the input and trust of the consumers. And like Facebook, in the Netherlands, young people are leaving Facebook now to join niche platforms because they don't trust Facebook anymore. So Facebook is now really powerful, but I think in 10 years it will be gone. So I think, by that way, I think that in long term the power is always to the crowd, because they are also putting the value in the big companies like Facebook or Amazon.
Thank you, Martin, for your prediction.
Yes, my name is Lawrence Lessig, and I wanted to follow up with my colleagues, Professor of Literary Property and Ms. Albanel. So it's an absolutely false dichotomy to say that the choice here is between protecting copyright or not protecting copyright. That's not the choice in the 21st century. That was the debate in the 1990s. The debate today is just how best to protect copyright. What's the right way to protect copyright? So what should the rights look like? So I'm always struck when, for example, the reflection on whether in the French experience it was a mistake to criminalize, quote, piracy. And the response was, well, no, maybe we shouldn't have criminalized it. We should have just had a very high fine. But of course, there's an alternative tradition in copyright law, in European copyright law, which the Germans are developing, the Green Party, when they talk about a cultural flat rate, which would have said the way to protect the artist was to have something like a cultural flat rate where the artist would have earned money when people shared their work without criminalizing a whole generation of kids. So the question we ought to be asking is, what is the right way to achieve the return that artists deserve and also encourage the kind of sharing in cultural creativity, which I think the younger generation is demonstrating. And to frame this as if it's a choice about whether we protect or respect copyright or give money to artists or not, just is a debate that I had hoped we had been long past.
Merci, c'était une question qui était un peu...
Thank you. That was the question at the center of this debate. Would you like to answer that, and then Paul can answer it? Yes, I understand what has just been said. Nobody wants to criminalize, in the strict sense of the word, this type of activity. I think that we have made people a little more aware of the ethical nature of copyright, and should not be confused, as the lady said earlier on, with the American version of copyright, which isn't the same thing. So I am proud, in a way, of having done what we did. I think we have made people more aware of copyright without criminalizing. I think we did it in a way which made people more aware of what was at stake here, and that, I think, is part of our culture, and I'm proud of that. And another comment, I think there was another thing that was said earlier on. I have 4 kids, and I can see how they work with internet. And I don't think they are very aware of the ethical issues. They live on the internet, and they're not really aware of everything about art, and they're not really aware of everything that is available to them. And they need to be educated about the values of art and how to respect it. Our young people have access to everything, and they must be educated to manage what they have properly, and it's that learning which is important, and it's an important part of their education, and I think we don't have that today. I can see the way my kids work on the internet. They download films even before they're on in the movie theater. And I'm really astonished about how they manage to do that at the age of 12, 13, or 14. But they do. And we really must teach them the values of ethics and governance. Thank you very much indeed. Let's leave it at that. I'd like to thank all the participants at this round table. Thank you very much indeed for your presentations and your comments. And this brings us to the best part of the day, which is the lunch break. So have a good lunch and look forward to seeing you this afternoon. Have a great lunch. I hope you will. And please be back here at in this room at 2 p.m. so that we can continue. Thank you very much and have a good lunch.
Get me down on my knees. We call it master and servant. We call it master and servant.